For James, a senior software consultant in his late 30s, the email arrived without fanfare, a simple subject line: mortgage refinance options. He glanced at the interest rate, far higher than what his parents secured decades ago for a home twice as large in a similar neighborhood. It wasn't a crisis, but a quiet, persistent reminder that even with a household income of $210,000, and despite doing everything right, the goalposts seemed to shift. He had earned his degree, built a successful career, and saved diligently. Yet, the notion of starting his own company, or even moving closer to his aging parents, felt less like an ambition and more like a significant, almost insurmountable financial risk. This wasn't about a lack of income. It was about the diminishing power of that income to translate into the kind of flexibility and forward momentum his parents experienced. His situation is not unique. Across America, a quarter of families, often those in their prime earning years, are finding themselves stretched thin, navigating rising costs for housing, childcare, and elder care simultaneously. It raises a fundamental question. If hard work, education, and responsible financial choices are still being made, why does the promise of economic upward mobility feel increasingly out of reach for so many? The landscape of American economic life has undergone a profound transformation. For generations, the narrative was clear: work hard, get an education, and each successive rung on the ladder would lead to greater prosperity than the last. That vision once propelled millions into the middle class, defining what became known as the American dream. Yet, for many like James, this foundational belief now feels distant, almost nostalgic. Consider the bedrock of middle-class stability: homeownership. The median home price has surged dramatically over the past 2 decades, far outstripping wage growth in most major metropolitan areas. This isn't just about the initial purchase. Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs have also climbed, turning homeownership from an asset that builds wealth into a constant drain on monthly finances. It's a reality reflected in recent data, showing that over half of American families now struggle to afford a secure life in their own communities, a figure that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. Beyond housing, the very definition of a good job has shifted. While James's income of $210,000 might seem robust, it buys considerably less stability than a similar income did for his parents. Healthcare, for instance, is increasingly tied to employment, creating a golden cage where even desirable roles come with the implicit threat of losing critical benefits if one takes a risk or changes direction. The cumulative burden of student loan debt, now totaling trillions nationwide, also casts a long shadow, deferring major life milestones and diverting funds that might otherwise fuel new businesses or family savings. This financial tightrope is further complicated by the sandwich generation phenomenon, a term that describes adults simultaneously supporting both their children and aging parents. Roughly a quarter of Americans between 40 and 59 now find themselves in this position, often contributing financially to both ends of the family spectrum. Imagine trying to save for your own retirement, put children through college, and cover a parent's medical expenses all at once. For many, it's not a temporary squeeze, but a new, entrenched reality that demands difficult choices and often forces a re-evaluation of personal aspirations. The data reveals a stark picture. Since the 1970s, the percentage of adults living in middle-income households has steadily shrunk, while the concentration of wealth at the very top has only intensified. The wealthiest 1% of U.S. households now control a disproportionate share of the nation's total assets, far exceeding the collective wealth of the bottom 50%. This widening gap doesn't just represent a statistical anomaly. It signifies a fundamental shift in how wealth is generated and distributed, making it harder for those without existing assets to gain a foothold. These interwoven pressures paint a picture where diligence and intelligence are no longer sufficient guarantees of advancement. The economic game has changed, with the rules favoring those who already possess capital and connections. It begs the question: how does one navigate a system where the path to upward mobility has become so much steeper? And what does this mean for individuals who, despite their best efforts, find themselves running in place? Let's delve deeper into James's specific circumstances to understand these abstract forces at a more personal level. For James, the senior software consultant we met earlier, his financial life is a carefully constructed edifice. His household income of roughly $210,000, combined with his wife Sarah's part-time work, places them well above the national average. They own their home, a modest split level in a good school district, purchased 7 years ago. Their retirement savings are solid, exceeding benchmarks for their age. By all traditional metrics, they are successful, a testament to years of dedicated effort and smart choices. Yet, a subtle anxiety permeates their comfortable existence. It's not about immediate survival, but about the long game. The escalating cost of simply maintaining their current standard of living and providing for their 2 young children. Just last month, the school district announced a significant bond measure to fund new facilities, which, while necessary, meant another incremental increase in their property taxes. It's a recurring theme. Every improvement in their community comes with a direct, unavoidable financial obligation. James often thinks about his father, a civil engineer, who by 38 had already taken the leap to start his own consulting firm, eventually building a substantial business. That kind of entrepreneurial pivot feels almost reckless to James now. The family's health insurance, for example, is entirely tied to his employer. Leaving his job would mean navigating the bewildering and expensive private healthcare market, a risk too great with 2 young children and Sarah's part-time income. It's a tether, unseen but felt, keeping him firmly anchored to his current role. His ambition isn't gone. It's simply been rechanneled. The dream of starting his own company, once a clear aspiration, has been replaced by the quiet necessity of job security. He's recently been tasked with mentoring a new, younger team member, fresh out of college, who embodies the sharp, hungry energy James once possessed. Watching him, James feels a quiet admiration, but also a pang of concern for the financial hurdles this new generation will face. Hurdles that are, in many ways, even higher than his own. The most immediate forward pull in James's life is the upcoming tuition deposit deadline for their eldest child's preschool, due in just 2 weeks. It's a significant sum, and while budgeted for, it represents another line item that didn't exist for his parents, who sent their children to a public kindergarten. This annual ritual, repeated for their younger child, adds up quickly, a constant reminder of the ever-increasing cost of foundational opportunities for their kids. They want to ensure their children have the best start, but the best seems to come with an ever-inflating price tag. The challenge isn't just about income, but about capital. James and Sarah have accumulated some equity in their home, but not enough to easily leverage it for a new business venture or a significant move. The prospect of selling their current house, paying agent fees, and buying into the current market with its elevated interest rates and fierce competition feels like a step backward, not forward. They're not stuck in a bad situation, but rather they're perfectly positioned in a stable one, which ironically makes any substantial change feel like a monumental gamble. He's even considered taking a sabbatical, a dream he's harbored for years, a few months to travel with his family, perhaps explore a new skill. But the thought of losing income, dipping into their hard-won savings, and then re-entering a competitive job market after a break is enough to keep it firmly in the realm of fantasy. The perceived cost of stepping off the career treadmill, even temporarily, is too high. This isn't just James's story. It's a mirror reflecting a broader economic reality, where the levers of individual ambition are increasingly constrained by systemic forces that redefine what progress truly means. James's experience, while deeply personal, resonates with a growing number of American households. What he perceives as individual challenges, the cost of changing direction, the tether of employer-based benefits, the pressure of private school tuition, are in fact symptomatic of deeper structural shifts. These are not isolated incidents but interconnected forces that have systematically reshaped the path to upward mobility, creating a landscape where financial progress demands more than just diligence. It demands a constant, often exhausting, fight against an accelerating current. One of the most profound shifts is the ascendance of asset inflation over wage growth. For decades, a steady income and consistent savings were sufficient to build wealth. Today, however, the value of appreciating assets, particularly real estate, and certain financial instruments, has outpaced the growth in median incomes. This means those who already own assets see their wealth grow passively, while those relying on earned income find their purchasing power eroded, making the initial leap into asset ownership increasingly difficult. The housing market, for instance, has seen prices surge at rates far exceeding wage increases in many urban centers, effectively locking out a significant portion of the population from a traditional wealth-building mechanism. This isn't to say that individual choices play no role. Some argue that local zoning restrictions, often driven by existing homeowners, limit housing supply, and drive up prices. Others point to personal spending habits, suggesting that improved quality of life amenities and discretionary purchases contribute to higher costs of living. It's true that consumer preferences have evolved, and local policies undeniably impact specific markets. However, these explanations often fall short when attempting to account for the broad national trend of declining affordability across diverse geographies and income brackets, suggesting forces at play beyond individual agency or localized policy decisions. Consider the role of debt. Student loan debt, now a staggering burden totaling well over $1 trillion, acts as a significant drag on an entire generation. It delays homeownership, postpones family formation, and stifles entrepreneurial ventures. Young professionals, even with high-paying jobs, find a substantial portion of their early career earnings diverted to loan repayments, preventing them from accumulating the seed capital their parents might have used to invest or start a business. This isn't just about the cost of education. It's about the long-term economic ripple effect of delaying wealth accumulation at critical life stages. Moreover, the labor market has become increasingly bifurcated. While highly skilled workers like James command impressive salaries, the demand for credentials has simultaneously inflated. A bachelor's degree, once a differentiator, is now often a baseline requirement, pushing many into graduate studies simply to remain competitive. This credential inflation means greater upfront investment in education, with no guarantee of commensurate returns, essentially raising the bar for entry into middle-class professions without necessarily elevating the actual ladder. Healthcare dependence and employer-based benefits further entrench this structural rigidity. For many, health insurance isn't just a perk, it's a non-negotiable necessity, particularly for families with children. This creates a powerful disincentive to leave a stable job, even if it means sacrificing career aspirations or geographical flexibility. The golden handcuffs aren't always about high salaries. They can be forged from the essential benefits that a private individual would struggle to afford, making the pursuit of independence a financially daunting prospect. The combined effect of these pressures manifests as a significant slowdown in economic mobility. Data suggests that intergenerational mobility has declined across all 50 states and income levels since the 1940s, a child born into the lowest income quintile today faces a challenging climb, with a significant percentage remaining in that same quintile as adults. Conversely, those born into the top quintile also show a strong tendency to remain there. This isn't a judgment on individual effort, but an observation of a system that increasingly rewards inherited advantage and existing capital, making the journey from one rung to the next far more arduous for those starting from scratch. This growing disparity is often framed through the lens of wealth concentration. The fact that the wealthiest 1% of U.S. households now hold a disproportionate share of the nation's total assets, while the bottom 50% hold a mere fraction, highlights a fundamental reordering of economic opportunity. It suggests that financial progress is less about annual income and more about access to appreciating assets and long-term stability, which are increasingly concentrated at the top. As the cost of entry to these wealth-building mechanisms rises, the very nature of economic advancement shifts, leaving many to wonder if the game has fundamentally changed, moving the ladder itself out of reach for those who once hoped to climb it. This leads to a quiet, yet profound, psychological toll on individuals who, despite their best efforts, feel a growing sense of frustration and exhaustion. The cumulative weight of these structural shifts isn't just financial. It imposes a subtle yet profound psychological toll, reshaping how individuals perceive their own efforts and their place within the broader economic narrative. For generations, the idea of climbing the ladder evoked a clear image, a stable, stationary structure where each upward step was a testament to one's diligence and ambition. But what happens when the ladder itself begins to move, slowly ascending even as you strive to climb it? This metaphor of a moving ladder captures the essence of a new kind of exhaustion. Many households like James's are not failing to progress. They are simply running harder to stay in the same relative position. The initial confidence that hard work would inevitably lead to a better life gradually gives way to a persistent underlying anxiety. It's the feeling of constantly battling an invisible current, where simply maintaining one's standard of living requires an ever-increasing output of energy and vigilance. Consider the emotional burden of the sandwich generation. While financially supporting both children and aging parents, they are forced to confront the stark reality that their carefully laid plans for retirement or career advancement are now secondary to immediate, multi-generational needs. This isn't a brief period of sacrifice. For many, it becomes a new baseline, an entrenched reality that reshapes their entire financial outlook and personal aspirations. How does one plan for a future that seems to demand constant resource allocation to the present? This persistent pressure creates a subtle erosion of the core American belief in meritocracy. The idea that individual effort is the primary determinant of success. When people diligently pursue education, work long hours, and save responsibly, yet still find themselves struggling to achieve milestones their parents reached with less apparent strain, it can lead to a quiet disillusionment. It's not an angry rejection of the system, but a weary questioning of its fundamental fairness. The psychological impact extends to risk-taking and innovation. Entrepreneurship, once a celebrated pathway to upward mobility, now appears dauntingly difficult for many without substantial existing capital. The costs associated with leaving a secure job, particularly the loss of employer-sponsored healthcare and the specter of student loan debt, create a golden cage where ambition is often stifled by the imperative of stability. This cautious preservation of what one has can inadvertently limit the very dynamism that traditionally fueled economic growth. For younger generations, this reality manifests as a shifting of expectations. The dream of homeownership or achieving financial independence at a certain age becomes delayed, often indefinitely. They are not necessarily less ambitious, but their ambition is tempered by a clear-eyed understanding of the systemic headwinds they face. This can lead to a sense of resignation, where striving for radical upward mobility is replaced by a more pragmatic goal, simply finding and holding onto a stable foothold in an increasingly competitive and expensive world. This collective experience, shared by millions across different income brackets, subtly but profoundly alters the fabric of society. It's not a sudden crisis, but a slow, grinding shift that redefines the very meaning of progress. The pursuit of a better life gradually morphs into the pursuit of staying where you are, making the definition of success less about how high one rises and more about how much effort it takes just to remain on the ladder, a ladder that continues its slow, relentless ascent. The persistent pressure we've explored, the feeling of running harder just to stay in place, ultimately redefines the American narrative of progress. James, with his meticulously managed finances and impressive income, still faces that email about mortgage refinancing options, a quiet reminder that the cost of simply existing, let alone thriving, has fundamentally changed. His desire to start his own company or take a sabbatical isn't a failure of ambition. It's a collision with a system where the cost of flexibility has become exorbitant, tying him to a path chosen more out of necessity than pure aspiration. The American dream never promised identical outcomes, but it always held out the promise of forward motion, the belief that effort could translate into tangible improvement. That ideal, once a powerful engine of social mobility, is now navigating a landscape where structural forces increasingly overshadow individual agency. It's not that opportunity has vanished entirely, but rather that the path to it has become steeper, more intricate, and far more demanding of resources than in previous generations. When economic mobility slows and the rungs of the ladder become further apart, the consequences ripple through society. It subtly shifts the national conversation, moving from questions of "how high can I climb?" to "how can I avoid falling?" This shift impacts everything from career choices to family planning, influencing how individuals envision their future and the legacy they hope to build. It asks us to consider whether the definition of success itself must evolve, and what it truly means to strive for a better life in an economy that demands more and more just to maintain a foothold.